June 29th, 1956. If you were alive that summer, you remember where you were when the news broke. Marilyn Monroe, the world's most famous sex symbol, had just converted to Judaism. But what the newspapers didn't tell you was this. 24 hours later, in a secret ceremony at the Westchester County home of Arthur Miller's literary agent, Marilyn stood under a traditional chuppah and became a Jewish bride. The white dress the photographers captured, that was just the legal paperwork. The real wedding, the one that would get her films banned across the Middle East, the one that made Cairo newspapers scream betrayal, the one that Hollywood studio heads tried desperately to hide, happened behind closed doors with a rabbi, ancient prayers, and a broken glass symbolizing the destruction of the temple. While 20th Century Fox executives were calculating the millions they'd lose in Arab markets, Marilyn was whispering Hebrew vows she'd spent months memorizing. The world knew her as the girl in the subway grate, the breathy voice, the ultimate Gentile fantasy. But on July 1st, 1956, Marilyn Monroe became Marilyn Miller, and the woman who emerged from that ceremony would never be forgiven by an industry that demanded she stay exactly who they'd created. What happened in those 48 hours didn't just change a marriage, it changed Hollywood's relationship with religion, politics, and the Middle East forever. Before we continue with this story, if you're fascinated by the hidden scandals and untold truths of Hollywood's golden age, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you the real stories behind the legends, the moments that changed entertainment history, and the secrets the studios tried to bury. The story begins in 1951, when Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller met on a Fox soundstage. She was 25, climbing toward stardom. He was 36, a Pulitzer Prize winner visiting Hollywood. What nobody knew was that they began writing letters, secret correspondence continuing for 4 years while both were married. In those letters, Marilyn didn't write as the manufactured siren. She wrote about books, politics, her desire to be taken seriously. Miller responded with genuine intellectual engagement. By 1955, after both divorces, they weren't starting a relationship, they were continuing one built through ink and paper for half a decade. But there was a complication. Miller wasn't just a playwright, he was a Jewish intellectual whose identity was inseparable from his cultural heritage. When Miller told Marilyn in late 1955 that he couldn't marry her unless she understood what it meant to be part of his world, she didn't hesitate, not as publicity, not to please him, but because someone was finally offering her genuine identity, a history stretching back thousands of years, a community that had survived everything. In January 1956, while gossip columns buzzed about the blonde goddess marrying New York's cerebral playwright, Marilyn began secret meetings with Rabbi Robert Goldburg in Brooklyn. She'd slip out wearing a dark wig and sunglasses, taking taxis to a modest synagogue. In Rabbi Goldburg's study, surrounded by Hebrew books, Marilyn Monroe began studying to convert to Judaism. The process was rigorous. Rabbi Goldburg made clear he wouldn't facilitate a celebrity conversion for publicity. If Marilyn wanted to become Jewish, she would do it properly. Months of study, genuine engagement with thousands of years of history and law, sincere commitment. Most celebrity conversions took 3 or 4 months. Marilyn's took 6. She began attending Friday Shabbat dinners at Miller's family home in Brooklyn. His parents, Isidore and Augusta Miller, were initially skeptical, but over weeks Augusta saw Marilyn wasn't performing. She was genuinely hungry for family ritual and continuity. During one Shabbat dinner in March, Marilyn asked Augusta to teach her to braid challah bread. The two women spent an afternoon in the kitchen, Augusta's worn fingers guiding Marilyn's through the 3-strand technique representing love, truth, and peace. Augusta explained how her mother taught her this method in a Warsaw kitchen decades earlier. When the bread emerged golden, filling the kitchen with warmth, Marilyn cried quietly. She'd never learned to cook anything with a mother figure. This intergenerational transmission meant more than any award or magazine cover. That challah loaf represented what she'd been searching for, belonging. But forces were mobilizing against her. Someone tipped off gossip columnist Hedda Hopper about the conversion. Hopper called Spyro Skouras, Fox president, asking if he knew his biggest star was becoming Jewish. Skouras immediately understood the implications. The Middle East was crucial territory for American films: Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. Marilyn Monroe films performed exceptionally well in these markets, particularly Cairo, where her movies routinely outperformed other releases. But these were countries where religious identity and Arab-Israeli politics were increasingly sensitive. Israel had been founded just 8 years earlier. The Suez Crisis was brewing, anti-Western sentiment was rising, and now Hollywood's biggest star was about to align with Judaism. Scoras could already see the diplomatic cables, censorship boards, banned film lists. Scoras called an emergency meeting. The message was clear: stop this conversion at any cost. Studio lawyers researched morality clauses in Monroe's 7-year contract. Publicists drafted careful statements. Production executives calculated losses using complex formulas that factored in current box office, future projections, and international distribution agreements. The numbers were staggering. Monroe Pictures had generated $2.3 million in Middle Eastern box office in 1955 alone. With 2 completed films awaiting release, Bus Stop and The Prince and the Showgirl, plus The 7-Year Itch still playing in some territories, and several projects in various development stages including Some Like It Hot, the total potential loss approached $12 million, an astronomical sum in 1956 equivalent to over $100 million today. The studio sent 3 executives to New York on March 15th. They met Marilyn at the St. Regis Hotel with flowers, compliments, and carefully calibrated threats. The senior executive, a man who'd worked with Monroe since her early contract days, led the conversation. The conversion would be a public relations disaster, he explained. Her fans, particularly in the American heartland and the South, women who went to her movies to escape their ordinary lives, might turn against her. Christian women's groups were already uncomfortable with her sexuality. Adding religious controversy would ignite a firestorm. And then there was the international situation. Did she understand the economic ecosystem at stake? The theater owners in Cairo who'd invested their life savings in projection equipment specifically to show American films? The distributors in Beirut who employed dozens of people? The hundreds of concession workers, projectionists, ticket sellers whose livelihoods depended on Hollywood's continued access to Arab markets? Did she realize she'd be portrayed as a traitor in countries where she was beloved? Marilyn listened politely to everything they said. She asked clarifying questions about contract obligations. She appeared to consider their arguments with genuine thoughtfulness. The executives began to relax, thinking they'd reached her. Then she stood up, smoothed her skirt, thanked them for coming, and said 7 words that ended the conversation: "I'm going to marry Arthur as myself." The silence in that hotel room was absolute. The executives flew back to Los Angeles defeated and shaken. One of them later told a colleague that the terrifying thing wasn't Marilyn's defiance. They'd dealt with difficult stars before. The terrifying thing was her certainty, her calm, her absolute clarity that she was making a choice between her career and her soul, and that her soul was going to win. This wasn't a movie star throwing a tantrum or testing her power. This was a woman who'd calculated the cost and decided to pay it. What the studio didn't know was that Marilyn had already completed her conversion. On June 1, 1956, in a private ceremony with only Rabbi Goldburg and 2 witnesses, Marilyn Monroe formally converted to Judaism. She immersed in a mikveh, ritual bathwater covering her completely, symbolizing spiritual rebirth and emergence into new life. She recited the Shema, the central prayer declaring God's oneness. In Hebrew she'd practiced until her pronunciation was nearly perfect, and she took a Hebrew name, Rachel. She'd chosen it after reading Genesis with Rabbi Goldburg, identifying with biblical Rachel's story of waiting, of being underestimated, of struggling with fertility, of dying young but being eternally remembered as a matriarch. When the conversion was complete, Rabbi Goldburg handed her an official certificate with her Hebrew name inscribed in beautiful calligraphy. She folded it carefully, placed it in her purse next to her compact and lipstick, and walked into the summer afternoon as Rachel Monroe, a Jewish woman. 28 days later, she would trigger an international crisis that would validate every fear the studio executives had expressed in that St. Regis hotel room. June 29th began at 9:30 at the Westchester County Courthouse in White Plains. Marilyn wore a champagne sweater and beige skirt. Arthur Miller wore a dark suit. Judge Seymour Rabinowitz performed the civil ceremony in 11 minutes. The vows were standard. The kiss was brief. Then photographers descended. Headlines screamed about the mismatch. Egghead weds hourglass. This was the wedding the world saw. Almost nobody had the real story. 48 hours later, the actual wedding happened. Kay Brown's Katona home had been transformed. A chuppah stood in the backyard, 4 poles wrapped in white silk, canopy covered in roses and peonies. Beneath it, 2 wine glasses and a cloth-wrapped glass for the ceremony's conclusion. 20 guests attended: Miller's parents, his children from his first marriage, close friends, Lee and Paula Strasberg, photographer Sam Shaw, sworn to secrecy, and Rabbi Goldburg, with a Torah scroll and prayer book. Marilyn appeared at 3 o'clock in a champagne cocktail dress and heels. Over her platinum hair, a lace mantilla, serving as a prayer shawl. She walked toward the chuppah, on Lee Strasberg's arm, having no father for that role. Guests later recalled she looked more serious and beautiful than they'd ever seen her. This wasn't the movie star. This was Rachel becoming a Jewish bride. Rabbi Goldburg began in Hebrew. Ancient words hung in summer air, weighted with 4,000 years of history. He translated into English, explaining each ritual: the blessing over wine, the ring, the ketubah reading. Then Marilyn's moment, her Hebrew vows. She recited them slowly, carefully pronouncing each word. Her accent was American, delivery uncertain, but commitment unmistakable. Arthur responded with his vows. Rabbi Goldburg wrapped both their hands in his tallit and spoke the 7 blessings sanctifying a Jewish marriage. Then Arthur placed the cloth-wrapped glass on the ground. In Jewish tradition, the groom shatters glass at the wedding's conclusion, remembering the temple's destruction even in greatest joy. Arthur brought his foot down hard. The glass shattered with a crack that made Marilyn jump. Then she laughed and whispered to Paula, "Did I do it right?" Guests shouted Mazel Tov. The ceremony was complete. Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller were married according to Jewish law, in a ceremony that would never appear in newspapers, that Hollywood would never acknowledge, and that would ultimately cost Marilyn more than anyone in that backyard imagined. For 3 weeks, the religious ceremony remained private. The civil wedding generated controversy enough. Then, on July 18th, someone leaked the Jewish ceremony story to international press. The source was never confirmed, though rumors suggested a disgruntled Fox publicist who wanted to force the studio's hand. Whatever the source, the reaction was immediate and devastating. The story hit Arab newspapers first. Al-Ahram in Cairo, Egypt's most influential daily, ran a front-page headline on July 19th, "Monroe betrays Arab audiences, converts to Judaism in secret ceremony." The article, mixing verified facts with speculation and political interpretation, portrayed her conversion as a deliberate political act, an alignment with Zionism and American imperialism, a rejection of her Arab fans who'd made her wealthy. The rhetoric was inflammatory, designed to wound. Within 48 hours, Egyptian authorities banned all Marilyn Monroe films, not just future releases, everything. Bus Stop, which had premiered in Egypt just 3 months earlier to record breaking crowds and lines around city blocks, was pulled from theaters mid-run. The 7-Year Itch, which Egyptian women had watched dozens of times, copying her subway great dress and her walk. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which had introduced American musical comedy to a new generation of Arab audiences. How to Marry a Millionaire, which young Egyptian women quoted to each other about career and marriage. Every Monroe film was suddenly forbidden, vanished overnight as if she'd never existed. Lebanon followed within a week. The Lebanese censorship board, under intense pressure from religious authorities and political groups seeking to demonstrate solidarity with Egypt, declared that Marilyn Monroe films promoted values incompatible with Arab and Islamic identity. Syria banned her films on July 27th with even harsher language. Jordan on August 2nd. By mid-August, Marilyn Monroe had been effectively erased from Middle Eastern screens. The speed and coordination suggested this wasn't spontaneous but orchestrated, a political message using Hollywood's biggest star as the medium. Theater owners who'd built their businesses on Hollywood glamour were furious and frightened. In Cairo, the owner of the Metro Cinema, which had shown Monroe films exclusively for 2 years, faced bankruptcy. He'd invested in new seating, upgraded projection equipment, trained staff specifically for American musicals. Now his theater sat half empty, showing Italian neo-realist films that didn't draw crowds. In Beirut, a distributor who'd secured exclusive rights to Monroe pictures for Lebanon and Syria found himself with warehouses full of banned film prints, contracts worth nothing. The human cost was real and immediate. Projectionists laid off, ticket sellers without wages, concession workers closing their stands. Hundreds of families found themselves in economic crisis because of a wedding ceremony 7,000 miles away in New York. But the political message mattered more than individual suffering. Arab governments were demonstrating that they controlled their cultural space, that Hollywood's reach had limits, that even the most glamorous American star couldn't cross certain lines without consequences. Back in Hollywood, Skouras delivered his ultimatum: make a public statement distancing herself from Judaism and Israel, or face permanent consequences. The statement was already drafted by studio lawyers and publicists, every word calibrated for maximum damage control. It would describe her conversion as a private spiritual journey undertaken to honor her husband's family traditions and emphasize that it carried no political implications whatsoever regarding Middle Eastern affairs or the Arab-Israeli conflict. Marilyn would stress her love for all fans regardless of religion or nationality, express hope that her films would continue bringing joy to audiences everywhere, and perhaps hint at regret for any unintended offense. It was a carefully worded non-apology that attempted to diffuse controversy without explicitly renouncing her conversion. When Marilyn's agent read it to her over the phone, she listened in complete silence, then asked one question: "Does it say I'm sorry for becoming Jewish?" The agent hesitated, parsing the language. "It implies regret for the controversy your decision created." Her response was immediate and final: "Then I won't sign it." The agent, panicked, explained the cascading consequences. The Middle Eastern ban would become permanent and possibly expand. Future projects would be canceled. Other studios would avoid her. She'd be labeled box office poison. She could be professionally blacklisted, not officially through some conspiracy, but through whisper campaigns and nervous executives who didn't want controversy attached to their productions. Marilyn listened to the entire catastrophe scenario and then said something her agent later described as simultaneously the bravest and most financially foolish thing he'd ever heard a client say: "I spent my whole life being what other people needed me to be. Not anymore. I'm finally real." Hollywood's revenge was devastating. Fox shelved Monroe projects, scripts went on hold, directors were told she was unavailable, other studios followed. When word spread that Monroe cost Fox $12 million, producers viewed her as toxic. By late 1956, career opportunities were shrinking despite her fame. The films she did make succeeded despite studio nervousness. Yet Marilyn never regretted her decision. In private letters and rare interviews, she spoke about her conversion not as a mistake but as liberation. She'd found something fame couldn't provide: continuity, belonging to something ancient and meaningful. The Friday Shabbat dinners where Augusta taught her to light candles, the Hebrew prayers she practiced, the sense of belonging to a community that had survived every persecution. These meant more than applause from audiences who only loved a manufactured image. Miller later wrote that watching Marilyn light Shabbat candles for the first time in their Connecticut farmhouse was profoundly moving. She'd insisted on doing it properly, covering her hair, standing before candles with intense concentration. Her hands trembled as she circled them over flames 3 times, drawing light toward herself. Then she covered her eyes and recited the blessing in careful Hebrew, voice barely a whisper. When she opened her eyes, she looked at him with pure hope and vulnerability. Miller understood. She wasn't performing anymore. For perhaps the first time, Marilyn wasn't playing a role. She was trying to become real, to connect with something deeper than image. She was trying to save her soul, but authenticity brought unexpected complications. Miller, raised culturally Jewish but religiously secular, found himself married to a woman more observant than he was. He valued his Jewish identity intellectually and politically, especially fighting McCarthyism, but actual religious practice, the daily rituals, dietary restrictions, holiday observances, had never been part of his adult life. Marilyn wanted a kosher kitchen. Miller found it unnecessary. She wanted synagogue on high holidays. He preferred staying home. She wanted Shabbat candles every Friday. He forgot most weeks. The irony was almost comic. She'd converted partly to be closer to him, to understand his heritage, but in doing so, she'd become more Jewish than the Jewish intellectual she'd married. The conversion carried profound personal costs. Her relationship with Miller grew strained under public scrutiny and private disappointments. Miller's family embraced her warmly, but Miller himself seemed uncomfortable with her deep religious engagement. He was a secular Jew who valued cultural heritage but rarely attended synagogue. Marilyn found meaning in rituals and wanted regular observance. She wanted a kosher home, high holiday services, strong Jewish education for future children. Miller had envisioned an intellectual partnership, not a religiously observant wife. The irony cut deep. She'd become more Jewish than the Jewish intellectual she'd married. Then came the devastating pregnancy losses. Between 1956 and 1960, Marilyn experienced multiple miscarriages and an ectopic pregnancy. Each loss shattered her. She blamed herself, blamed past abortions, blamed the studio system that had demanded she stay thin. In her darkest moments, she wondered if God was punishing her. Why would God give her this new identity but deny her children to continue it? Rabbi Goldburg visited her in the hospital after one miscarriage. He told her that questioning God was itself a Jewish tradition, that arguing with heaven was what Jews had done for millennia. The conversation gave comfort, but grief remained. Her pill dependency accelerated during this period as physical pain combined with emotional devastation became unbearable without chemical escape. By 1960, the marriage was essentially over, though divorce wouldn't come until January 1961. Miller wrote The Misfits as a gift for Marilyn, but production became a nightmare with her pill dependency causing constant delays. The marriage that began with a forbidden Jewish wedding ended on a Nevada film set, both exhausted. After divorce, Marilyn's relationship with Judaism became more private. She still observed some rituals, still identified as Jewish when asked, but without Miller and his family, observance became irregular. When she died on August 5, 1962, at 36, funeral arrangements became complex. Joe DiMaggio took control, choosing a small ceremony at Westwood Village Memorial Park. Was it a Jewish funeral? Partially. Rabbi Max Nussbaum officiated with Hebrew prayers, but the ceremony included Christian elements, reflecting her complicated spiritual journey. Miller didn't attend. He was in Connecticut with his new wife, Ingi Morath. His absence was noted by everyone, forgiven by almost no one. The Middle Eastern ban remained for decades. Egypt didn't lift it until 1975, 13 years after her death. Lebanese and Syrian bans lasted into the 1980s. But symbolic impact outlasted practical enforcement. They proved Hollywood's global reach had limits, that cultural identity could matter more than entertainment value. When we look back at those 48 hours in June and July 1956, we see what contemporary observers missed. We see a woman making a choice that had nothing to do with publicity. Marilyn Monroe's conversion and Jewish wedding were acts of hope. Hope that she could be more than her image, that religious tradition could provide stability her chaotic life lacked. That those hopes were only partially fulfilled doesn't diminish the courage of the original choice. In a career defined by others' demands, the forbidden Jewish wedding was one moment when Marilyn Monroe chose for herself. It cost her millions, alienated audiences, contributed to professional marginalization, but it gave her something money and fame never could. A sense that she belonged to something larger and more enduring than Hollywood. That's the real story of June 9th. Not scandal, not controversy, but a profoundly human moment when one woman decided her soul mattered more than her career and acted with full knowledge of consequences. Maybe that's the most important legacy. Beneath the platinum hair and manufactured image was a real person making real choices about faith, identity, and love. A person who deserves to be remembered not just for how she looked or died, but for the courage it took to become who she wanted to be, even when the world demanded she stay who they needed her to remain.